So, Chip, what are some of the changes you foresee coming to the seed stock industry in the next 5, 10 years, maybe even out 15 or 20 years?
Pretty loaded question. First things I'm going to say, I can't see some of you. Is it easier, or do you prefer if we stand? I don't mind. I was an old judger back in the day. I can stand. Yeah. At least somebody's like, yes, stand up. Okay, thank you. Fair enough. That means you might have to. Who's to say? They want to see you more than they want to see me. To be clear, what do I see as the changes? Actually, I'm hoping over the course of the day I get a lot of that information from you all. You all live it every day, so I'd like to know your perspective on that. You feel your own personal pressures. I can talk some high level, and then I'd certainly like some feedback on it. Some things I think we can't ignore. There are organizations that are attempting to change the seed stock business a lot, right? A lot. And so if we step back and anybody have a dairy background? Anybody come from that? Yeah. How many dairy seed stock families genuinely matter when it comes to putting semen into large-scale commercial outfits anymore? Not very many, right? Not very many. What happened? We had semen companies saw an opportunity. They became, in a large extent, the seed stock supplier to the dairy business, right? How many of you grew up raising hogs? We did. Lots of them. There were lots of cows and lots of pigs, and you didn't know on which year which one would work best, but you at least had some cash flow with the pigs, right? I can remember I grew up working for the family down the hill from my mom and dad. We had a small commercial cow-calf outfit, but the family down the hill, I worked for a gentleman, I've said many times, he could have ran a Fortune 500 business. He could have done a whole host of things, but like many of you, he was just passionate enough and crazy enough to want to be in this business. And I was blessed to learn from him. And so, man, he ran a fescue seed buying business. I'm from Central Missouri. Ran hogs, all those kind of things. But I can also remember when his son, who later became my brother-in-law, who took over the pig business, when he began to realize, I might have chosen poorly. I might have chosen poorly. And so I only bring that up because in our own sphere, if you don't know it right now, we even have semen companies, some that you probably work with, some of who are friends of ours, okay, to be clear. They're making walking bulls, okay? It's not only that they're not making semen, just making semen and putting it in things, they're making walking bulls. So, the beef on dairy conversation, which will probably for the foreseeable future completely control 20% of the business. So, we just want to know these things because, and that doesn't even mention some of the large-scale beef outfits you might have thought I was going to mention that are trying to do some of these things. And so, what I would encourage us to accept is, what's your name, young man? Yep. Braden. So I typically tell folks, I only do what I do for one reason. I could dig ditches tomorrow. If the good Lord wants me to dig ditches, I'll be in better shape than I've been in a long time. So I'll go to dig ditches. But until then, most of those of you in here that are my age or older, maybe some of you a little more seasoned than I am, for the most part, we're going to be fine, right? We're going to be okay. We'll get through this thing. My job is to ensure there's a snowball's chance in hell that Braden wants to be in this business. And if he wants to be in this business, to help find tools and creative ways to keep him in the business. Because I often use a slide when I do give a talk, and it'll be one of my first slides. And it's an old rusty gate with a chain around it, Monty, and it has an old brand that's not even hardly legible. And I tell most folks that that's the most important slide I'll show. Now think about it for a second. Because almost every beef producer I know, their primary hope, their passion, sometimes even misplaced to an unhealthy extent, is that brand gets to stay on that gate when they are gone. That's our job here. So the seed stock business is changing. Whether you like it or not, it's more data-driven. There are days when we wish that wasn't the case. So to me, what I really admire in a conference like this, with a slate of speakers you don't get to have, tip of the hat to Matt Woolfolk. Phenomenal. Phenomenal lineup of folks. is to challenge ourselves so that we can think about what's the way that I need to change in my own personal business to make sure Braden, or my version of Braden, has not only the opportunity but the interest to stay in this business.
So I'll look, when we're looking at those changes that we're going to foresee coming, if we try to rub that crystal ball over the next 5 and 10 years as we focus, will the vertical integration become part of the cow-calf industry?
So I'm going to back up 1 second before we go into that one. In a lot of conversations, we see our business as adversarial, right? And let's just call it what it is. There are parts of our business that are a bit adversarial. You can't have buying and selling relationships that happen 3 and 4 times in a given animal's life and deny the fact that there's a buyer and a seller. It's the way this works. But I think one of the things that really excites me is, and I learned this, in the mid and late 90s, we were talking at breakfast briefly, Mr. Bone and I were talking briefly. So in the mid and late 90s, I worked in a little packing plant in Amarillo, Texas. And that plant in the mid 90s harvested 6,300 head a day. And I really learned about genetics maybe more in that packing plant than I ever did in a classroom. Because I was just some hillbilly from central Missouri who sort of thought I understood some cow stuff. And I even had a little bit of meats background. But what I was seeing, if you think about what was happening in the mid-90s, CEB was the volume increase per month that they were seeking. Remember, so CEB starts in 78. Some of you know the history much better than I do. And frankly, from like the late 70s to the early 90s, just kind of bubbling, and then boom, like that. And so I just happened to be there when it was just going boom, like that. And so I saw these massive changes that were coming at such a rapid clip. And at the same time, carcass weights, they go up 4 pounds every year. You may not like it. You may say, well, that's just nuts. Okay, maybe it is, but it's still true. And so the reality is, and so I bring all that up because one of the things I think is a little different today is that our packers have started to really appreciate that the traits that are important to them, you control roughly 50% of that trait. The traits that are of interest to them are highly heritable. Now, your commercial cow-calf guy, that's a harder conversation, right? That's a more difficult dance. But there's a pretty clear-headed. What does a packer care about? Frankly, really only 2 things, frankly. Make them big, make them rich-meated. You do those 2 things, they will pay you handsomely. Don't do those, they'll cut your heart out. It's their job, okay? So, but because they recognize those things are highly heritable, that means for the first time in my awareness, we have meaningful conversations with packers on a regular basis, seeking how can we help you all do a better job at your craft. Are they doing it out of philanthropic nobility? Maybe. Self-interest isn't a bad motivator at times either. And so we just want to acknowledge those things. And so then you take that into vertical integration. Gosh, I really want, don't wait for me or Monty to quit talking, because if you want a challenge on something, my name's Chip, say it real loud, or any 4-letter expletive that sort of sounds like Chip, history says I'll stop and answer to it, okay? Because if you want to challenge us, that's good. Maybe in your areas you have examples of this. Integration, most of them don't want to own cows very bad. Why? Owning land is, you all know, that's scary in today's world, right? Owning land. And it's not just the normal pressures. If I go down, Dr. Rowan's going to talk to you a little bit later. You all are experiencing it here, but I'd say in the East, they probably experience it as bad in Tennessee as any place, land pressure. And it used to just be from people like in Tennessee where they wanted to live there, right? But now it's not only just that, right? We've got solar farms. We have major financiers who are openly and acknowledging they're buying land and taking it out of production, right? That's their goal. And so we typically think this is going to cycle back. I don't know. But as long as land prices stay where they are, I'd be stunned if any corporate interest is going to come in and say, yeah, let me line up to own cows. Well, yeah, you chuckle, so yeah. Some of you might say, yeah, they own mine, I guess. But vertical cooperation is no question going to happen. And that's where this beef on dairy conversation, if you're not familiar with it a little bit, it might pet you backwards. But some of the positives of it is the data share is becoming pretty sophisticated in that space, and that's going to play over into our business. Some of it might feel forced on you at times, but that data share that they're learning in the beef on dairy sector is coming to us, just a lot slower. So we are going to do more cooperation. You saw, again, let's just make it fairly real. If you're in the West, not as much here, though I'm open to you telling me I'm wrong, but if you're out West and you're a large-scale producer and you're doing a reasonably decent job, dollar to a donut says an entity called 44 Farms has visited you at some point. If you're not familiar with them, you should get familiar. So is that an integrated model? Quasi, right? It's more of a cooperative model. So anyway, there's no question that we're going to continue to get more and more collaborative up and down the chain. If integration means owning cows, I don't think that's going to happen, because right now they don't need to, because they have access to all the dairy uteruses they need. And you might say, well, yeah, but the dairy business has gotten smaller. Well, you might think the dairy business has gotten smaller because the dairy people that live next to you are gone. Dairies went through consolidation that made the pig consolidation of a handful of years ago look like a pup. In the course of about 5 or 6 years, the dairy business went, and now if you don't run at least 1,000 mama cows, you better have some kind of niche program on the edge of an urban area and do it in glass bottles and stuff. And you can be very successful doing that. But actually there are as many dairy cows, by some estimates, actually slightly more dairy cows today than there were 10 years ago, just a fraction of the number of producers.
Yeah, and I would share with what you're saying, Chip. If I ask everyone in here, how many registrations does the American Jersey Association do annually? You're going to have an opinion, and it's not going to be quite this high probably, but they're registering over 300,000 head. And a lot of those cattle are part Holstein. And the Holstein's registering a lot of cattle, and a lot of those cattle are part Jerseys, and that's your beef on dairy. And it's going to become a big part of our future in the beef industry. And even when we go to NCBA or whatever, those dairy producers do produce beef.
But yes, this is another thing, and it hurts. It hurts me a little bit personally. I come from a very similar background. I knew a number of the folks in here a long time. Some of them know me from the time when I even actually had hair. It was cool. Not like yours, Mr. Bowman. I never looked quite like the Marlboro Man, but I did have decent hair at one time. So it does hurt a little bit to say what I'm about to say. But even fairly small-scale dairies will sell more beef calves in a matter of a few months than most fairly large-scale beef guys will sell all year. It's not a judgment, it's just an observation of the facts. We want to know what we're up against because, again, we don't want to shy away from the facts if we're going to keep braiding in this business.
Moving forward a little bit, so will the access to genetics and selection change? Like joining a genetic cooperative programs versus a current model of a breeder independence?
Oh, we want to be John Wayne, right? Who doesn't want to be? If you don't, I've gotten old, Mr. Bedwell, is how I know. Every once in a while, my wife comes in when I have like a few minutes to not think, and we rarely turn the television on other than every once in a while I'll watch my alma mater find a new and ever creative way to lose a ball game. But when I do turn it on, she'll catch me watching some old dang Western. She's like, oh my gosh, you became your dad. Yeah, I know. I want to be John Wayne. I want to pretend like I could have that kind of swagger and that independence, or the man from Snowy River. Wouldn't that be lovely? It just isn't true. Just isn't true. Trying to live that way going forward, again, is going to be challenging. So from a genetic evaluation standpoint, and what do we know? You all know this personally as breeders better than anybody. There might be somebody in this room who's breeding a line of shorthorn influence cattle that is highly disconnected from some of the other cattle in the room, genetically, right? It's plausible. Pretty much any breed is make it personal. So if I go to our own population, into the Simmental specific population, right? So we still have some folks who are full-blood breeders, right? Full-blood, Fleckviehs, you remember them. And that's wonderful. It's a good thing. They did a lot for us. If you don't recall the story, a lot of these Continentals come in the 60s and 70s, and it continued even into the 80s a little bit. And as they became Americanized, most of them become hybrids. That's the way it worked. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. By the way, watch the IGS TV show we'll have after Labor Day. It's an awesome conversation on this, but that's a different deal. But those same cattle, most of those who built it initially, they don't play exactly in the same way in the modern beef business, right? Doesn't mean they don't have merit. So some of our full-blood breeders, at times, when they were at one point the bulk of our population, and now they make up about 1.4%, what happens? Their population gets small. So no matter how committed they are to their craft at getting better, there's not enough critical mass. And no doubt somewhere in a publication somewhere you all have looked at your biological curves, right? And if you're going to make progress, you need folks who are standard deviations ahead of you on those tails. And when you're in a small population or an isolated population, if you don't have that, it nearly doesn't matter how hard you try. Because it can't just be you. You have to have other folks with the same basic breeding objectives helping you so you can reach out. And so, why do I say all that? Because it's going to be more vital than ever that folks like us can collaborate, because as we look right now, private genetic evaluations, that doesn't mean they don't do good math, okay? But a lot of private genetic evaluations are trying to bring everything in-house. They can do good math. The problem is you don't get to verify their math. Right? It is trust me. Just trust me. I'll look honest, you don't know me from Adam. How would you know if you should trust me or not? And so that is happening in our business. I mean, I could name them. You probably know them. And so these private evaluations, one of the differences is when you work in most typical breed associations, certainly within the IGS platform specifically, our job is to work for Braden. But we have to be aware enough to know that we can believe our own hype after a while. Anybody, even if your intentions are good, if you don't talk to people outside of your own house, you can start to believe your own noise. So we have to let competent scientists who don't work for us look under the hood, because that's what keeps a genetic evaluation on track, right? You have talented people, and you have other people kind of checking the math, as it were. One of them he'll sit right here and talk to you a little bit later, and there's a lot of other folks just like him. And so privatization of genetic evaluation is a serious change in our business, serious. And where it's most serious is when those folks can go to your client, that commercial client that you've trained up for the last couple decades to appreciate various genetic values, genetic prowess. And they come in and say, well, I'll deliver that, and by the way, I'll be there to bid on those calves at the sale barn. How many of you don't raise your hands. This is rhetorical. How many of you are in a position to go to the sale barn and try to buy back your customers' calves? Most of us aren't. But you know as well as I do. Many of you know if somebody came to you and said, I'll help you make the breeding decisions if you let me buy your calves. Some of you'd be like, We won't talk in the front yard where people can see us when they drive by, but we might go talk out on the back deck. Okay? So the business is changing. And so that's why I would encourage you all, at all cost, be as eager and aggressive with thoughtful data collection as you can possibly be, because you all are getting to make the decisions right now, if your kids and grandkids are going to get to stay in this business. And it's not going to be, well, I called in the office the other day and I didn't like the way Monty answered the phone. Frankly, he pissed me off. Okay, that's fine. Suck it the heck up. Because the reality is, we need, whatever he was telling you, he's probably telling you, hey, you harvested some cattle and you didn't send me those carcass records. Why not? Get that data in. What's going to empower you and your family to do what they want to do is everybody in this room rowing in a similar direction. Because what we don't have the latitude when we're in smaller populations, you fractionalize up this room in 5 spots, you know how fast you'll get where your objectives are? You'll get nowhere. So you have to be rowing in the same direction if we're going to continue to help you all do what it is you need to do.
I'm going to ask you, kind of go off our script here a little bit. So we're talking about a little bit about genetic evaluations here, and you mentioned that more than once. So give us a little bit of the advantages of IGS versus some others. We've talked about private sector deals, but we really look at what IGS is doing for our breed, particularly here today, but really what does it do for the entire industry as one of the largest multi-breed genetic evaluations in the world. Probably is the largest.
Actually is by a drove, actually. But so I'm going to back up and start one more time. I always work through the premise of the commercial client, right? As seed stock folks, if our clients win, we win. If we win and our clients don't win, we don't win very long. And to be clear, that is equally true whether you sell commercial bulls or you sell show heifers. If your clients aren't successful, your tenure is short. So that's from where I start, is how do we empower that commercial client? And if we're going to do that, first things first, we built this model, unnecessarily, I would argue, where they actually struggle to be able to compare whether they should buy your bull or the other bull, their family down the road who has a sale tomorrow. And maybe they sell, they sell Red Angus bulls down there, and you're selling your Shorthorns and Shorthorn composites. And the math to figure that out historically has been really difficult. Almost seems by intent. Yeah. Just saying. And so one of the premises, a couple core premises of IGS. One core premise. No single breed has all the corner on profit, period. Anybody who says otherwise is foolish or blowing smoke. The other thing is, again, we are better together. For example, let's make it real. Let's say you didn't do anything different other than Shorthorn said, tomorrow, we're going to remove ourselves from the IGS population, okay? We're still going to calculate the same EPDs, the same indexes, but we're just going to do it that way. The only problem is you would do it with a fraction of the amount of data. Well, actually, to Matt's knowledge, Matt's concern would be like, yeah, but we lose all of the IGS scientists? Yeah, you got it. But I'm assuming you have the resources to solve all that, okay? So you can replace the entire science team. So let's assume that's not the concern. Even if you can do science well, you lose massive volumes of data because you know what? In that Red Angus population, there are folks who've used Shorthorn cattle. You won't have access to those genetics. In the Gelbvieh herds, in some of the Simmental herds, in some of the Braunvieh herds, and some of the other herds that are in our population, they have Shorthorn genetics, of which you'll never understand how those function. So you end up getting much less data. Let's make it very real. So the largest population in IGS, the largest population, if they pulled themselves out of IGS, they would have exactly half the amount of data to work with in a genetic evaluation that they have because they're within IGS. Why? Because, again, other populations are using their genetics. the smallest, and it may not be the smallest, one of the 3 smallest populations in IGS, they get 13 times as much data because they're within IGS. That means their genetics have been used in other breed associations, and because we all pool our stuff, they have so much more data to work with. So the beauty of IGS is by collaborating and working together, we magnify the impact that any one of us has. And I don't care how much money a given breed association has, it doesn't have enough money to do everything it wants to do at the clip it needs to do by itself. Not any of them. And I do mean any of them. So for when some of you are going, yeah, but, no. Okay? And so that's why, from my standpoint, if we're going to serve our commercial clientele, if we're going to serve our own kids and grandkids, collaboration, in particular for fairly small populations, is the only plausible chance of making that happen long term.
Yeah, and I would add to some of that we go back a few years when we were wanting to try to get genomics before Shorthorn had genomics. Your board of directors was really pushing hard to get to genomics because some of the other breeds were already there. So I was talking to Wade at IGS, and I said, just get me some genomics. I was frustrated. We needed genomics. Well, he run them so we could see what we had. We only had 71% of the data was Shorthorn data. When we pulled Shorthorn out away from that, we were losing 39% of the data that we had involved in calculating a Shorthorn EPD. So it's really valuable what you're saying. This crossbreed reference has made us a lot more accurate.
And can I throw one thing? When Monty brings up genomics, also note that at the IGS level, when we are negotiating certain things, right? So any of us by ourselves, when we're trying to negotiate with a genomics firm, where do genomics firms make most of their money? Everywhere but cattle. If you don't know this, cattle are like way out on the very end of their concerns. Their money in dogs and cats and ponies and fish and shrimp. I know, I'm telling you. That's where they make their big money. So even the biggest players in our business are reasonably bit players to some of the DNA firms. So now, if you're bit players to start with, and then you subdivide yourself, you have essentially no negotiating power. You have zero leverage. But when we negotiate for IGS, we don't just negotiate for a single population. In some of our research protocols and some of our research opportunities, we're negotiating on behalf of all of you. And so when said DNA firm says, well, we'll do this for you, but not for you, we're like, well, we'll walk then. Well, fine. If you're going to act like children, we'll just give it to all of you. Okay, we'll act like children if that means we can help you all have a few more dollars to jingle in your pockets.
Okay, we'll move on just a little bit here to what are some of the things that a shorthorn breeders can do to prepare their operation or business in the future? I know you've already touched on that a little bit, but I think there's rubbing the crystal ball for the future to me, and if you've read any of my articles, it's all about technology, and we got to have data to make the technology work. So I'll let you elaborate on that.
Well, crystal ball time, I guess I'll just start at a fairly simple level. I think certain things we'd like to change, but we got to be honest, do we have the ability to change them or would you see them changing? So we shipped cattle just a few weeks ago for a project. Some of those fat steers weighed 1,700 pounds. How many of you ever thought 15 years ago you'd see 1,700 pound steers? Now, I need you to be honest on this one, to the extent that you can. How many of you like that we make 1,700 pound steers? How many of you it kind of bothers you inside? Yeah, I get it. I get both sides. But here's the reality. If you're a packer or if you're a cattle feeder, don't trust me on this, most of you don't know me. Go do your homework. There is not a single price signal in this business, not one, that tells a cattle feeder or a packer to make them smaller. Not one. We need to understand that. You might not like it, but it's true. So the question to me is, what are you going to do about it? And here would be my contention. Can we manage this? Clearly we can. But what we can't do is the same things we've always done and expect a different outcome. Dr. Rowan and I were talking a little bit ago about a data set. What the old cowboy approach to a steer away about what his mom does when she's mature. Anybody ever hear that before? Anybody? You do that now, you are going broke. For one or two reasons. If your cows weigh 1250 and your steers weigh 50, they are going to cut your heart out when you sell those calves. And if you say, well, I sell mine as feeders, so I'm immune. No, you're not. The guy who buys them in this sale barn knows your cattle better than you do. Mark it down. You are not immune. And so, seriously, you try to sell a 1,200-pound calf in today's business on the open commodity market, they will take you to the woodshed. You want to see the kill sheets? I can show you. They want calves that are 14 and a half plus. We'll sell 1,800-pound calves before we'll sell 1,200-pound calves again. In fact, I can tell you right now, I know of a grid that would allow me to sell 1,800. That's about an 1,160-pound carcass-ish. So, my challenge to you is when it comes to these things, probably the biggest challenge we have to think about as we serve our clientele and our own personal business is how am I going to think through the economics of a cow herd while still making a terminal calf who has enough value that somebody wants to pay up. And by paying up, my gosh, my goodness. It's insane what these calves are. And most of us also didn't think we'd ever see the prices, right? So that poor order buyer, who we might scoff at on occasion, can you imagine how much he is out over his skis on the few potloads of cattle he put together for somebody? I mean, he's exposed, right? So empathize with that person. Our colleague, Jackie Atkins, we have a colleague, Dr. Jackie Atkins. And Jackie tells me all the time, and so I say it all the time, clarity is kind. Clarity is kind. There's a lot of truth to that, right? The older we get, the more we appreciate. Don't dance. Just tell me. I can take the pain. I'm a big kid. So what are you going to do about it? Here's my contention. My contention, from a commercial producer's perspective, if they are going to straight breed, I would say it's near impossible for a commercial producer in today's business to straight breed and keep a cow herd that's both simultaneously sub 1,400 and generating terminal calves that are consistently north of 1,500. I think if you are straight breeding, that's impossible. You might disagree with me. That's fine. And if you disagree with me, I want you to disagree with such vigor that you go do your homework. And I think what you're going to find is, while you might be right, it's pretty rare. Pretty rare. So what does that mean? We are going to have to find a way for a lot of our commercial clients to seriously think about this is where I think the biggest change needs to come in the business. Think about your respective business model. Way too often, I think we just make cows. We make cows we like. I make the cows I like. That's cool. Anybody ever heard of a Studebaker? We need to make things that make the next person more successful at their craft, whomever that is. And so ponder the business model, yes, yours, but more importantly of your clientele's. Now, mind you, are there ways to get around selling 1,500-pound calves? Yeah. If you're selling local locker beef, do they want to buy a 1,500-pound calf? No. My gosh, frankly, they probably don't want to buy a quarter right now, right? When you tell that client who's been coming to your house and buying out of the freezer for a while what a quarter of beef costs, I mean, they just shudder. It's a good thing you got lots of bourbon right really close here because they're going to need a shot of it to go with that beef they're picking up. It's painful. So help them think about their business model. But if they're working in the commodity sector, think about what's important in the commodity sector. If they can decommoditize, phenomenal. Lean into that and embrace that with a lot of vigor. But what we should do, what this group, this would be my encouragement to you, is what most folks are going to do over the next handful of years. They are going to gripe and whine. They are going to gripe and whine because they don't like where calf sizes are. My cows are getting too expensive. Okay, that all might be true. But you got a breeding season coming up not too long down the road. Let's start doing something about it.
Going on forward, so we've talked about what breeders can do for the future. What can the American Shorthorn Association do to help prepare for the seed stock beef industry?
Well, first and foremost, continuing some of the mindset you clearly presently have. That is one that is transparent, it's candid, it believes in quality, credible science. Now, and when I say that, I want to balance it with something. There are a lot of times, I can turn on the evening news tonight, and there will be somebody that tells me something that makes me mad at the level of my gut. And they'll say, well, it's because of science. I'll say, no, you actually don't understand science. Science has to be tempered with values, right? Because science is temporary. Science is constantly changing. It has to be linked to a core set of principles and values and an ethic that matter. And so, to me, where I think you find yourself, as a populist, as I do know some of you, I'm blessed to know some of you, I certainly know your leadership, is this ethic of let's lean into credible science, but let's do it with a constant desire to benefit our membership and their clientele. What do I think any breed association who should deserve to exist in 2030? If you're a breed association that deserves to exist in 2030, what should your core competency be? I'm not saying it's your only competency, your core competency. It should be the most sophisticated genetic evaluation you know how to be involved with. We have other things we need to do. We need to do them well. But if that's not your best thing, if that's not the thing you put most of your skill set in, and that means from their team that's acquiring data cleanly, sharing it with us, we report it back, having their ability to share and understand and spread that data to you. Your job is to collect data as hard and as fast as you can. And a lot of us, for seed stock producers, we don't have enough of the data. We turn our cows over too fast, right? So it's really hard to get a longevity metric on our cows, right? Because some of us are designed. Or maybe you work in a show ring space, or not even a show ring space. Maybe you move a lot of bulls and you use a lot of donors and you get a lot of daughters out of those donors, and you realize after you call Matt and chewed on him because the stability didn't move on a particular donor, and you say, well, she's got, I don't know, we've registered 65 daughters out of her. I go, yeah. And her stability, and she's been around for so long and her stability hadn't done anything. And then when he goes in the system and goes, you know how many of those 65 actually have any measure past weaning? 0. Happens frequently. I get that call on occasion where somebody's mad because the state didn't reflect what they think it ought to be. Give us some data, okay? Give us some numbers to work with. And so here's the tangible thing I would ask you to do. The tangible thing. I ask every serious seed stock producer to consider this. Go find your best client or two. Do everything you can to encourage them, if they have the aptitude for these things, to put their herds inside the genetic evaluation. There are different ways they can get that done. You can talk to Matt later about the details of that. By the way, they can do it for a fraction of the cost you can do it, okay? Why is that important? Because they're getting longevity records you will never get. They are selling a lot of terminal animals and keeping large groups together where you're pulling one out because, I got to get him ready for this sale, and or I topped off my bulls and I didn't have a place really to put those bottom end steers, so I just got them out of here as quick as I could because they were in the way. Those folks are going to get more metrics out of their terminal animals. So invest in your clientele. Find your 1 or 2 best commercial clients. get them inside the eval. Even if you have to walk them through it and hold their hands for the first couple of years, you have your own testing grounds in, because whose genetics are they proving? Yours. In a way that you'll never be able to prove them. I think that's a very tangible step that you can do to help buffer some of the unknown and to acquire that data that you're just never going to get off your farm or ranch.
I'm going to ask, we're getting to a wind down here a little bit. So is there any questions before I keep asking questions? Is there questions anybody else has to ask Chip? Yeah.
Here, come. Just so they can hear.
What's driving the elevation in the carcass weights?
What's driving, again, there are people in here, the man who owns this building, he could probably talk to these things better. But again, I think there are a couple things we do know. One, even before massive swings in the cow herds, right? If we go back, let me set the table. I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and I promise I'll come back. What do we grade today? By grade, choice and prime, what do we grade today? Ish. We wish. We're close, though. We're getting close. We grade roughly in the mid-80s in terms of percent choice and prime. Maybe one week it's 82, the next week it might be 86. That's where we live. Prime has grown, as many of you have heard the stories, right? Seriously, it's, again, depends upon the week or the month, somewhere between 10 to 13% of the marketplace is prime. Just 15 years ago, that was like 3. So we know that, okay? So if we're sitting in the mid-80s, we're going to call it. What did we grade 13 years ago? Pretty darn close, 63%. 63%. So this era that we live in, we kind of live in a situation where we think, well, this business is static, right? The beef business just looks like this. The modern beef business is only 60 years old. The first boxed beef plant was only roughly 60 years ago. And way too often we kind of fall into a rut. Well, it looks like this. Not really. So 13 years ago was 63%. What was it 13 years before that? Well, we can do some math. So we're kind of in the late 90s. That was bad. Yeah. You remember, you're putting, our Continentals at that point have had numerous generations, right? We're in the late 90s. They're coming in. We graded 63%. These are USDA numbers, not mine. But I was in the plant in that exact era. Now, the last time I'll go backwards. What did we grade 13 years before that? Yes, we did. Though the grading standards did change a little bit. Actually, in the mid-90s, they changed. We can talk about why they changed a little bit if you want to know about that. It had to do with some Mexican cattle and some heiferettes. 13 years before that, we graded over 90. And 13 years before that, we graded about 90. So I only bring all that in because things changed. But the one thing that over that whole time that didn't change, carcass weights went up 3 to 4 pounds a year. Boom, boom, boom. So they were always going to go up. Why? Because growth is highly heritable and we like it. And what's the sexiest metric on sale day? And frankly, I would contend even in an era of 1,700 pound steers, if you know how to crossbreed, it shouldn't be. Sexiest metric on sale day, if you're at most commercial bull sales, is yearling weight. Probably shouldn't be, but it is. Now, what do I think magnified that? What I think magnified it is what we would call the Finney County fire. Remember? Remember the Finney County fire from just a handful of years ago? And what happened? That was right before COVID. And what happened? One of the largest packing plants in the world went offline. Cattle backed up for months all over the Great Plains. By the way, there's no water left in the aquifer. That's a whole scary thing relative to the beef business. I don't even know what that means. those cattle got backed up. And what did packers and feeders learn? One of the most profound lessons they learned is straight bred, more or less, Angus cattle that had to be held for another month. It didn't go super well. To be clear, I'm not gloating. This isn't talking smack on Angus, right? This is just an observation of facts, right? Because anybody says, well, we don't need Angus cattle in the business, you're just fooling yourselves, okay? We just don't need any 100% Angus cattle in the business. That's also just as equally as foolish. But what did they learn? They learned those cattle that are responsibly crossed, that have the ability to be a little more flexible and nimble in their weights, they could hold them. They could hold them. And then what happened? They harvested those cattle at weights that they thought, well, this is kind of be a one-off. And they realized, no, it's not a one-off. And oh, by the way, right after that, they hit COVID, and they couldn't get employees. And they're like, well, this shackle, that metal's not going to bend till like 2,000 pounds. So the more meat I can get hanging on that shackle, the more efficient my manufacturing plant becomes. A packer is a manufacturing plant. And they too, much like you, are trying to efficiently use the grass in your pasture, your own time, the dollars you have access to in your credit line. They're trying to be efficient in that plant. And what they found on steroid is something they already knew. The more meat I hang there, the more efficient I am. Now, combine that with the fact that the cow herd numbers are where they are, and beef production, you all have seen the stats, right? Many of you have seen the stats. We produce more beef today than we've ever produced, with far fewer cows that have existed than in our lifetimes. I think that's a phenomenal societal story from an efficiency, a resource usage kind of mantra. And there's just zero reason to think that's going to back up. And if it does, my concern is it comes this way. I know the cycle will turn. I don't know if it's going to turn as fast this time. We can call Daryl Peel and ask Daryl if you want the details on that. But I think the other conundrum here is not only the drought and all the other challenges. Again, back to Braden. I think a large part of this, and I think many of you know this and feel it personally, is that when your kids look at the math, when it's their time to step in and take over, they're like, Mom and Dad, you sacrificed everything for this? This don't pencil. That doesn't have to be the case. We all know that. It does not have to be the case. But too often in the beef business, it is the case. And so what's going to happen? We'll get 3 or 4 million more cows in the business. What'll happen? We will lose leverage. Your calf values will go down. Then all of a sudden they can do whatever they want with weights again for the short term. So in some ways, the carcass weights are a bit of a symptom of an era when it's really successful for us at the cow-calf level. We'll just see how far we can ride it. So, yeah, one more question, then I'll be quiet.
Chip, let's go a little further in that, because we have dropped a part in the cycle of the end customer. Which we've gone bigger. We completely said to the housewife or to the retail customer, we don't give a damn what you want. Because that housewife, back in the 80s, what drove carcass weight was that housewife wanted that 16-ounce ribeye that came out of about a 12 square, it was an inch thick. What does a 16-ounce ribeye out of an 1,800-pound steer look like today? And how are we getting that customer to go, okay, that's acceptable?
Yeah, phenomenal question. And this is quite often one of the most frequent, competent pushbacks from cattle producers is they're like, even when I was 16, I couldn't eat a ribeye that was that big, right? However, a couple things to point out. If you're familiar with the National Beef Quality Audit, anybody familiar with that thing? They run it every 5 years. They started it back in the 90s. The last beef quality audit says this. There is essentially zero, it's not zero, but essentially zero concern about tenderness in the modern beef business. That's a huge success story, right? Because when they first started, I can't even remember the percentage, but it was a massive number of steaks that would be returned because they just weren't edible. So tenderness is all but no more a concern. Now, some of that's probably tenderness, some of it's marbling, and if you don't know, marbling is just an insurance policy. It lubricates your mouth, it tricks you into things. Some's tender, even if it isn't. That's what marbling is all about. But the flip side of that, as we've made them bigger, the cuts no longer look the same. So, for a while, I would have probably tended to fall where you fall, but here's what my friends in the packing business tell me. You do your job, I'll do mine. And what they have found is very novel ways to make these cuts. They don't always look the same way you and I classically thought in our 4-H meats judging contest way back in the day that it should look. For example, that cap muscle on a ribeye, that's my muscle, by the way. If you want to eat something, that's the thing. Quickly, that's becoming peeled off and sold separately. By the way, I still have a picture. I could find it if I was in my phone. I was in Vegas for a conference a number of months ago, Monty. They were selling the cap muscle alone at one of these just stupid price restaurants, right? So you're in Vegas. It's just, it's hedonism on steroids. Cap muscle, $88 a pound. Yeah, just asinine. But it shows you what we're doing. So we're partitioning. It's not unusual at all now to see a strip loin that when you and I thought about a strip, we thought about this. Most of them now, they don't know any different. Frankly, for most of the customers, was it a good eating experience? That's good enough for them. It doesn't look like what it used to. Now that strip is like this, okay? I just cut it in half because they still need to keep it thick enough so that it can cook upright. So I would tell you, I think in large extent, the packing business has greatly adapted their own processing schemes to how this works. And so something that I think at one time was a valid concern is for the most part been mitigated. Again, in the commodity beef business, if you're selling in a local butcher shop through some freezer beef type approaches, that's going to be a different answer because they expect something different. So 30 seconds. You will have a tremendous lineup. I mean, I'm serious. Many of the speakers are dear friends of mine and people I respect immensely. And the ones I don't know is just because I don't know them yet. I still respect them immensely because I know their personal accolades. Your team has put together, I'm just telling you, you go look at the other Beef Association lineups for the annual meetings this year. Appreciate this, absorb what makes sense, discard what doesn't make sense to you, but really dig into it because you've got some of the most thoughtful minds in the business that'll be with you today and tomorrow. And thank you.
Thank you, Chip. We got some shorthorn glasses to drink that bourbon with. We appreciate it.